when a desperate mother dog dragged her dying pup through a brutal snowstorm. She had no idea that her last hope lay in the hands of a broken man who had vowed never to love again. What followed was a battle against time, nature, and despair that would redefine what it means to fight for the ones you love. The wind roared like a wild beast, slamming against the thick forest trees, its icy breath slicing through the air. The world was painted white, snow piled high, erasing every path, swallowing every sound. Amid the storm's wrath, a golden retriever staggered forward, her trembling body shielding the tiny, lifeless figure in her jaws. Her name was Bella, and her golden fur was matted with ice, her paws cracked and bleeding from miles of relentless trekking. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop, the pup hanging limply in her mouth. Her last surviving baby, Charlie, had stopped moving hours ago, but she refused to let the cold claim him. At the edge of the storm-beaten forest, Bella spotted it, the dim glow of a cabin's window, her heart hammered with a flicker of hope. She didn't know who lived there, but she knew she had no other choice. With the last ounce of strength in her failing body, Bella reached the porch, laid Charlie gently on the frozen wood, and let out a desperate, mournful howl that pierced through the howling wind. Inside, Lucas, a man who had long since given up on life, sat staring at the fire. The haunting cry made him freeze. When he opened the door, the sight before him would not only change his life but would push both man and dog to their absolute limits in a fight for survival, love, and redemption. Lucas stood frozen in the doorway, his breath fogging in the icy air, his rugged face, framed by a scruffy beard, twisted in confusion and concern as he took in the scene before him. A battered golden retriever lay collapsed on his porch, her ribs heaving with every strained breath. Beside her, a tiny pup barely clung to life, his fur matted with frost. For a moment, the only sound was the wail of the storm. Lucas's heart clenched as the dog lifted her head. Meeting his eyes, there was something raw in her gaze, a mix of pleading and determination. She didn't whimper, didn't bark. She just stared, her golden eyes filled with a desperation that cut through the cold and pierced his very soul. "What the—" Lucas muttered, stepping cautiously forward. Bella didn't move, her body too weak to react. She had spent everything she had to get here. Her only action was a feeble nudge of her nose against Charlie, urging the man to do something, anything. Lucas hesitated, his hand hovering near the doorframe. He had spent years isolating himself from the world, retreating into this cabin to escape the pain of his past. People, connections, emotions, they all felt like threats to his fragile existence. And yet, here was this dog, shattering his solitude with nothing more than her presence and a silent plea. He shook his head, muttering to himself, "I don't do this anymore. I don't." But as he looked at the pup lying motionless on his porch, his tiny chest barely rising, something stirred inside him, something he thought he had buried long ago. Without another word, Lucas knelt down, scooping the pup into his arms. The cold of its little body shocked him. "Geez, you're freezing," he murmured, glancing at Bella. Her eyes never left him. Carefully, he reached out and slipped an arm under Bella's frail body. She flinched but didn't resist, too drained to protest. Lucas carried them both into the cabin, kicking the door shut against the storm. The warmth of the fire seemed to bring a flicker of life back into the room. Lucas placed the pup on an old wool blanket near the hearth, his body so still it made his chest tighten. Bella staggered to her feet, ignoring her own pain, and crawled to Charlie's side. She nudged him gently, licking his frost-covered fur, as if willing him to wake up. Lucas watched in silence, his hands gripping the back of a chair. He felt a pang of guilt. He didn't even know how to help them. "All right, think," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. He grabbed an old heating pad from a cupboard, plugged it in, and slipped it under the blanket where the pup lay. He then poured warm water into a bowl, setting it in front of Bella. "Drink," he said softly, kneeling beside her. Bella hesitated for a moment, her instincts wary, but the exhaustion won out, and she lowered her head, lapping at the water with weak, deliberate strokes. As the hours passed, Lucas stayed close by, adding wood to the fire and checking the heating pad. Bella barely moved, keeping her nose pressed against Charlie, her breath shallow but steady. Lucas sat cross-legged on the floor, staring at the two of them. "What happened to you out there?" he asked quietly. Of course, Bella didn't answer, but her body told the story. The scars on her legs, the frostbite on her ears. She had been through hell, and she had fought through all of it for this tiny pup. "You don't give up." "Ha!" Lucas whispered. His voice broke slightly, surprising even himself. "Guess I used to be like that. A long time ago." Bella's ear twitched at the sound of his voice. She lifted her head weakly, her golden eyes locking onto his. It was as if she understood. Lucas leaned back, exhaling deeply. He had lived alone for so long, shutting the world out to protect himself from more heartbreak. But now, for the first time in years, he felt something crack in the walls he had built, and it terrified him. As dawn approached, Lucas noticed the smallest sign of improvement. Charlie's breathing had become a little less labored, his tiny body twitching as if fighting to wake up. Bella, seeing this, let out a soft whine and licked her pup's face with renewed energy. Lucas allowed himself a small smile. "He's tough. Must get it from you." He stood up, stretching his stiff legs. "All right, let's see what we've got." He rummaged through the cabinets, pulling out canned chicken broth and an old medicine kit. If Charlie had any chance, he needed to act fast. As he knelt back down beside the fire, Bella watched him closely. Lucas met her gaze, his voice soft but firm. "We're not giving up on him. Not yet." For the first time, Bella's tail thumped weakly against the floor. The storm outside raged on, howling against the cabin walls like a relentless beast. But inside, the soft crackling of the fire brought a fragile sense of warmth. Lucas sat beside Bella and Charlie, his hands working methodically to crush painkillers into powder and mix them into the lukewarm broth he had prepared. He held the bowl close to the pup's tiny nose, coaxing him gently. "Come on, little guy," he murmured, his voice softer than he remembered it being in years. "Just a little sip. That's all you need to get stronger." Charlie didn't move at first, his frail body too weak to respond. Bella whined softly, her eyes darting between her pup and Lucas. Her trust in this stranger, earned through sheer desperation, was palpable. Lucas didn't give up, tilting the bowl just slightly until a few drops touched the pup's lips. To his relief, Charlie's tiny tongue flicked out, tasting the broth. "That's it," Lucas whispered, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" Bella's tail gave another faint thump against the wooden floor, as though she understood. Lucas let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, his shoulders loosening for the first time that day. In that moment, he felt an unspoken bond forming between them, a connection forged in shared determination and fragile hope. As the hours passed, Lucas kept busy tending to the fire and preparing a makeshift bed for Bella. Her exhaustion was evident, but she refused to sleep, her eyes fixed unwaveringly on her pup. Lucas watched her in quiet admiration. "You're tougher than anyone I've ever met," he said, shaking his head. "And you're not even human." Before we dive further into this incredible story of resilience and love, I want to pause and connect with you, my amazing viewers. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever felt that special, wordless bond with an animal, hit that like button, because what happens next will make you believe in miracles. By the next morning, the storm had not let up, but the fire continued to burn strong. Charlie had managed to drink a little more of the broth and was now curled tightly against Bella's side, his breathing less strained. Lucas leaned against the kitchen counter, sipping his coffee and staring at the two of them with a mix of relief and apprehension. The pup was improving, but they weren't out of the woods yet. literally or figuratively. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden loud crack outside, the unmistakable sound of a tree limb snapping under the weight of the snow. Lucas set his mug down and peered out the frosted window. The landscape was a blur of white, the snow drifts taller than he'd ever seen. He muttered under his breath, "If this storm doesn't stop soon, we're all in trouble." Turning back to the small family huddled near the fire, Lucas knew what he had to do. The town's veterinary clinic was a long trek through the forest, but it might be their only chance. "I can't just sit here and hope for the best," he said aloud, as though convincing himself. Bella's ears perked slightly, her tired eyes following his every move as he began gathering supplies. Lucas rummaged through the closet, pulling out an old sled and a thick wool blanket. He folded the blanket carefully into the sled and tested its weight. "It's not much," he admitted, glancing at Bella, "but it'll have to do." The plan was simple but dangerous. Lucas would pull Charlie in the sled while Bella walked alongside them. It would be grueling, especially for Bella, who was already so weak. But as Lucas knelt beside her, gently stroking her fur, he could see the resolve in her eyes. She wasn't giving up on her pup, and neither was he. "All right," Lucas said, his voice steady. "Let's do this." He wrapped Charlie snugly in another blanket and placed him carefully in the sled. Bella stood slowly, her legs trembling but firm. Lucas opened the cabin door, and the bitter cold hit them immediately. The wind whipped at their faces, and the snow stung like needles against their skin. "One step at a time," Lucas said, gripping the sled's rope tightly. The journey was brutal. The snow was deep, each step an exhausting effort, and the wind roared as if trying to push them back. Bella trudged forward beside Lucas, her golden fur stark against the endless white. Every now and then, Lucas glanced down at her, marveling at her strength. She had already been through so much, yet she kept moving, her focus unwavering. At one point, Lucas stumbled, his boot catching on a hidden branch beneath the snow. He fell hard, the sled jerking to a stop. "Damn it," he hissed, pushing himself up. Before he could fully regain his footing, Bella was at his side, nuzzling his arm as if to say, "Keep going." He gave her a small, grateful smile. "You're something else. You know that." Hours passed, and the journey felt endless. Lucas's legs burned with every step, and his breath came in harsh gasps. But just as he thought he couldn't take another step, he saw it, a faint light flickering through the trees. "There it is," he breathed, a wave of relief washing over him. "We're almost there." As they approached the clinic, Lucas's heart pounded. He pounded on the door, his voice hoarse from shouting into the storm. "Dr. Meyer, it's Lucas. I need your help." The door creaked open, and an older man with kind eyes and a heavy coat stepped out. "Lucas? What on earth?" His gaze fell to the sled, and his expression shifted to one of immediate concern. "Get them inside, quickly." Lucas didn't need to be told twice. He lifted the sled over the threshold, Bella following close behind. The warmth of the clinic enveloped them, and for the first time in hours, Lucas allowed himself a sliver of hope. "Don't worry, buddy," he whispered to Charlie. "You're going to be okay. We've got you now." And with that, the next chapter of their fight began. Inside the clinic, the sharp smell of antiseptic mixed with the warmth of a roaring wood stove. Dr. Meyer moved quickly, his weathered hands surprisingly gentle as he examined the fragile pup. Bella sat close by, her body trembling not from the cold but from sheer exhaustion. She watched every movement with unwavering focus, her golden eyes filled with worry. Lucas stood silently against the wall, his arms crossed tightly over his chest as if holding himself together. The vet's voice broke the tense silence. "He's malnourished, dehydrated, and dangerously cold. But he's a fighter," Dr. Meyer said, glancing at Lucas. "I'll do everything I can." Lucas nodded, his jaw clenched. Bella let out a soft whine as Dr. Meyer injected fluids into Charlie's tiny body. The pup flinched but didn't resist. Too weak to do much more than twitch. "Hang in there, little guy," Lucas whispered under his breath, his voice thick with emotion. Dr. Meyer continued his work, his brow furrowed in concentration. He wrapped Charlie in a heated blanket and placed him on a small bed by the stove, turning his attention to Bella. He knelt down and ran his hands gently over her worn body. "She's exhausted, but she's a tough one," he said, giving Lucas a reassuring nod. "You found them just in time." Lucas exhaled deeply, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. "She saved him," he said quietly, almost to himself. "She's the one who got him here." The vet gave Bella a soft pat on the head. That kind of love is rare. She wasn't going to let him go without a fight. As the hours passed, the clinic settled into a quiet rhythm. Bella refused to leave Charlie's side, her head resting on the edge of his bed. Lucas watched them from across the room, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands. He couldn't take his eyes off the scene in front of him, the mother's unwavering devotion, the pup's fragile breaths, the way Dr. Meyer worked tirelessly despite the late hour. "Lucas," Dr. Meyer called softly, pulling him from his thoughts. "He's stable for now, but the next 24 hours will be critical. If his body can hold on, he'll have a chance." Lucas nodded, his throat tight. "What can I do?" Dr. Meyer handed him a bottle of medication and some instructions. "Keep him warm, keep him calm, and make sure he eats, even if it's just a little at a time. And don't let her," he gestured to Bella, "push herself too hard. She needs rest too." Lucas looked at Bella, who was now gently licking Charlie's fur as if to reassure him. "Rest isn't exactly her thing," he said with a faint smile. Dr. Meyer chuckled lightly, then his expression turned serious. "They've been through hell, Lucas, but so have you, haven't you?" Lucas stiffened at the words but didn't reply. He stared into his coffee cup, the memories he'd buried for years threatening to resurface. But before he could get lost in them, Bella shifted, her eyes locking onto his. There was something in her gaze that calmed him, a quiet strength that reminded him why he had fought so hard to bring them here. Morning crept into the clinic, the storm finally beginning to ease. Dr. Meyer stepped outside to clear the path to his generator, leaving Lucas alone with Bella and Charlie. The pup stirred slightly, his tiny body trembling under the blanket. Lucas leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Come on, buddy. You've got this." Bella's ears perked up at the sound of his voice, and she nuzzled Charlie gently. The room fell silent again, the only sound the faint crackle of the wood stove. Lucas leaned back, exhaustion pulling at him. He closed his eyes for just a moment, but when he opened them, Bella was standing, her body tense, her gaze fixed on the door. "What is it, girl?" Lucas asked, his voice low. Bella didn't move, her posture alert. Lucas followed her gaze to the clinic door, where the faint sound of footsteps crunching in the snow echoed from outside. He stood quickly, his heart racing. Who could it be? And what did they want with him? Or with Bella and Charlie? As the door creaked open, Lucas braced himself for what or who might be on the other side. Was this the beginning of a new challenge? Or the help they didn't know they needed? The wind lashed at Lucas and Ethan with relentless fury, each step through the knee-deep snow feeling like an impossible battle. The outpost was 2 miles away, but the storm made it feel like 20. Visibility was almost non-existent. The forest loomed like shadowy ghosts, the outlines of trees barely discernible through the blizzard. Lucas gritted his teeth against the biting cold, his focus unwavering. He couldn't fail, not when Charlie's fragile life hung in the balance. Ethan trudged slightly ahead, his movements confident despite the storm. "You sure you can keep up?" he called back, his voice muffled by the wind. "Just keep moving," Lucas barked, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The two men pressed forward in silence, their breaths heavy, the snow crunching loudly under their boots. Lucas's thoughts drifted to Bella and Charlie, back in the clinic, He pictured Bella's tired, golden eyes watching the door, waiting for him to return. That image fueled him, pushing him to ignore the screaming protest of his muscles and the icy burn of his lungs. After what felt like an eternity, a dark shape loomed ahead. The outpost, an abandoned ranger station, stood against the storm like a stubborn sentinel. Its roof sagged under the weight of the snow, but the structure seemed intact. "There it is," Ethan said, his voice edged with relief. He quickened his pace, Lucas close behind. They reached the door, Ethan pushing it open with his shoulder. The interior was dark, the air stale and freezing, but it was a reprieve from the howling wind. Lucas immediately spotted a pile of old supplies stacked haphazardly in a corner. A faint, almost forgotten scent of oil hung in the air, a promising sign. "Start looking," Ethan ordered, already rifling through the supplies. "We don't have time to waste." Lucas didn't argue. He rummaged through the clutter, his hands numb as he searched for anything useful. Old tools, empty fuel cans, broken lanterns. It seemed hopeless. His heart sank until his fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. Pulling it free, he held up a small portable generator. "Found it!" Lucas shouted. Ethan turned, his eyes lighting up. "Does it work?" Lucas examined the device, his fingers fumbling to check the components. It was old and battered, but it looked intact. "We'll need fuel." Ethan motioned to another corner, where several dusty containers were stacked. "Check those." Lucas hauled one of the containers over, twisting the cap open. A sharp, chemical scent confirmed it was fuel. Relief washed over him. "It'll do." "Good," Ethan said, already grabbing the generator. "Let's get back before the storm buries us." The return journey was even more grueling. The wind seemed angrier, the snow deeper, but Lucas held onto the thought of Charlie's fragile body and Bella's unwavering determination. Ethan carried the generator, his pace steady despite the worsening conditions. They didn't speak. There was no energy to spare for words. When the lights of the clinic finally came into view, Lucas felt a surge of hope so powerful it made his chest ache. They stumbled up the steps and burst through the door, the warmth inside hitting them like a wave. Dr. Meyer looked up from where he was sitting beside Bella and Charlie, his expression a mix of surprise and relief. "You made it," he said, standing quickly. "Thank God. We've got a generator," Lucas said, his voice hoarse. "Where do you need it?" Dr. Meyer pointed to the corner where the clinic's old system had been wired. "Hook it up there. I'll prep the equipment." Ethan and Lucas worked quickly, connecting the generator and refueling it with what they'd salvaged. The machine sputtered, coughed, and then roared to life, its hum filling the room like a heartbeat. The clinic's lights flickered, steadied, and glowed brightly. The heater kicked in moments later, the warmth spreading through the small space. Dr. Meyer immediately began checking Charlie, his practiced hands moving swiftly. Bella stirred, lifting her head as the room grew warmer. Her eyes found Lucas, and for a brief moment, the exhaustion in her gaze was replaced by something softer. Gratitude. Lucas knelt beside her, placing a hand gently on her head. "We're not giving up," he whispered. "Not on him. Not on you." Ethan stood back, leaning against the wall, his arms crossed as he watched. For once, he didn't say anything. After an hour of careful monitoring, Dr. Meyer straightened, his face lined with fatigue but his expression hopeful. "He's stable. The generator's giving us what we need to keep the equipment running. If we can keep this up, he's got a real chance." Lucas exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He looked at Bella, who had curled protectively around Charlie again. The pup's breathing was steady, his tiny body warmed by the blankets and heater. For the first time since this ordeal began, Lucas allowed himself to believe that they might actually make it. As the storm raged outside, the small clinic felt like a sanctuary, a fragile haven carved out of the chaos. Lucas leaned back against the wall, his body aching, his mind swirling with exhaustion and relief. Ethan caught his eye and gave him a small nod. A rare moment of unspoken understanding passing between them. Lucas didn't need words to know that something had shifted, not just for Bella and Charlie, but for himself as well. The walls he had built around his heart were cracking, and in their place, something new was beginning to grow, something worth fighting for. Lucas sat quietly in the corner of the clinic, his back against the wall, watching Bella and Charlie rest. The generator's steady hum filled the room, a comforting reminder that they had managed to buy more time. Dr. Meyer had fallen asleep in his chair, exhausted from the long night, while Ethan leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. For the first time in what felt like days, Lucas allowed himself to breathe. He had been running on adrenaline, each moment consumed by the fight to save Charlie. Now, with the pup's tiny chest rising and falling steadily, a fragile sense of hope began to take root. Bella stirred, lifting her head to glance at Lucas. Her tired eyes carried a silent gratitude that struck him deeply. "You're tougher than I'll ever be," Lucas murmured, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Ethan cleared his throat, breaking the quiet. "You're not out of the woods yet, you know." Lucas shot him a glance, his patience already thin. "What's that supposed to mean?" Ethan pushed off the doorframe, his voice low but pointed. "This storm? It's just the start. Supplies won't last forever, and neither will that generator if we can't get more fuel. You're putting everything on the line for a pup that might not make it." Lucas stood, his movements sharp. "If you've got something useful to say, spit it out. Otherwise, keep your doubts to yourself." Ethan smirked, shaking his head. Same old Lucas, always charging headfirst into a fight without thinking about what comes next. Lucas opened his mouth to fire back, but Dr. Meyer stirred, cutting through the tension. "Both of you, knock it off," he said, his voice groggy but firm. "We've got enough to deal with without adding a shouting match to the mix." Lucas clenched his fists but sat back down, his gaze falling to Bella and Charlie again. Ethan let out a soft chuckle but didn't press further, stepping outside to check the storm. The door creaked shut behind him, leaving Lucas and Dr. Meyer alone with the dogs. The vet leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "You're doing more than most people would, Lucas. But Ethan's not wrong. There's a long road ahead." "I know," Lucas replied, his voice quieter now. "But I've made it this far. I'm not giving up." Dr. Meyer nodded. "That's good. But saving them isn't just about keeping them alive. It's about figuring out what happens after." Lucas frowned. "What are you getting at?" Dr. Meyer sighed, his gaze softening. "Bella's not just any dog, Lucas. The way she's bonded with you, the way she fought for her pup. She's part of your story now, and you're part of hers. If you're going to fight for them, you've got to be ready to see it through." The words lingered in the air, heavy with truth. Lucas looked back at Bella, who had shifted closer to Charlie, her body curling protectively around him. He thought about the moment she had appeared on his porch, the sheer determination in her eyes. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about what came next. The door swung open abruptly, and Ethan stepped back inside, shaking snow from his coat. "Storm's dying down," he said, his tone brisk. "If we're going to resupply, now's the time." Lucas stood, his decision already made. "Then let's go." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You sure you're up for it?" Lucas didn't hesitate. "I'm not leaving anything to chance." Dr. Meyer gave him a steady look. "I'll keep watch over them while you're gone. Just don't take any unnecessary risks." Lucas nodded and grabbed his coat, following Ethan out the door. The snow had eased, but the cold still bit at their skin. As they made their way toward town, Lucas's mind raced with everything that needed to be done. He wasn't just fighting for Bella and Charlie's survival anymore. He was fighting for a future, a chance for them to stay together and move past the scars of the storm. Hours later, when they returned to the clinic, arms loaded with fuel and supplies, Lucas felt a renewed determination. The worst might not be over, but for the first time in years, he believed they could make it through. Together, the clinic was bathed in a warm glow from the fire and the steady hum of the generator when Lucas and Ethan returned. Their arms were laden with supplies, cans of fuel, blankets, and food. Bella stirred as the door creaked open, her golden eyes locking onto Lucas as he stepped inside. Her tail gave a faint thump against the floor, a sign of recognition that warmed him despite the lingering cold outside. "How are they?" Lucas asked, his voice low but filled with urgency. Dr. Meyer, who had been checking Charlie's vitals, looked up and offered a reassuring nod. "He's stable. The little guy's a fighter. Bella's been keeping him warm, and that's helped more than anything." Lucas crouched beside the two, gently stroking Bella's head. "Good girl," he murmured, his voice soft. Bella leaned into his touch, her eyes heavy with exhaustion but still watchful over her pup. Ethan placed the supplies on the counter, letting out a long exhale. "All right, we've done the hard part. What now?" Dr. Meyer wiped his hands on a towel and straightened. "Now we keep going. Charlie still needs time to recover fully, and Bella could use some proper nutrition to regain her strength. With the supplies you've brought, we've got a fighting chance." Lucas nodded, glancing back at Charlie, who let out a faint whimper as he shifted under the blankets. The sight tugged at Lucas's heart, and he felt the weight of the responsibility pressing down on him. But there was no room for doubt anymore. He had come too far to let anything fall apart now. As the evening wore on, the small group settled into a quiet rhythm. Dr. Meyer prepared a nutrient-rich broth for Bella, while Lucas worked on reinforcing the windows and doors to ensure the clinic stayed warm and secure. Ethan, ever restless, paced the room, his sharp eyes scanning every corner. "You know," Ethan said, breaking the silence, "this is probably the longest I've stayed in one place in years." Lucas didn't look up from his work. "What's your point?" Ethan smirked. "No point, just an observation. I'm not exactly the nurturing type, but this little rescue mission of yours, it's starting to grow on me." Lucas shot him a sidelong glance. "You're not fooling anyone, Ethan. You care more than you let on." Ethan chuckled but didn't deny it. "Maybe. Or maybe I just like a good fight." The conversation drifted off, replaced by the crackle of the fire and the soft hum of the generator. Lucas finished securing the last window and sat down heavily in a chair, his muscles aching from the day's exertion. His gaze drifted to Bella, who was now eating the broth Dr. Meyer had placed before her. Each slow lap of the bowl seemed to bring a little more life back into her. "She's incredible," Dr. Meyer said quietly, sitting down across from Lucas. "Most animals would have given up long before they reached your cabin. But not her. There's a strength in her I've rarely seen." Lucas nodded, his eyes fixed on Bella. "She's not just fighting for herself. She's fighting for him." The room fell into a contemplative silence, the kind that carried unspoken understanding. Lucas leaned his head back against the chair, his mind drifting. He thought about the man he'd been before all of this, isolated, angry, and lost. Bella and Charlie had changed everything. They had shown him a kind of resilience and love he hadn't believed existed anymore. Suddenly, Charlie let out a tiny bark, a faint, almost imperceptible sound. But it was there. Bella's ears perked up immediately, and she nuzzled him gently, her tail wagging weakly. Lucas bolted upright, his heart pounding. "He barked," Lucas said, his voice filled with a mix of awe and relief. "Did you hear that?" Dr. Meyer smiled, his eyes crinkling with genuine warmth. "I heard it. That's a very good sign." Even Ethan, who had been leaning against the wall, looked impressed. "Tough little guy, isn't he?" Lucas knelt beside Charlie, his hand gently resting on the pup's tiny body. "You're going to be okay," he whispered. "I promise." The moment was small, but it felt monumental. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about hope. Bella had fought with everything she had to save her pup, and now, against all odds, he was showing signs of life. Lucas felt a lump rise in his throat as he looked at the little family he had unknowingly become a part of. As the night deepened, the storm outside finally began to wane. The wind softened, and the snow fell in light flurries, blanketing the world in a peaceful stillness. Inside the clinic, the fire burned steadily, casting a warm glow over the room. Lucas, Bella, Charlie, Dr. Meyer, and even Ethan shared a quiet camaraderie, bound together by the journey they had undertaken. Lucas leaned back, exhaustion pulling at him, but for the first time in years, he felt something he thought he had lost forever, a sense of purpose. Bella and Charlie weren't just a responsibility to him anymore. They were a reminder of what it meant to fight for something bigger than yourself. As he drifted into a light sleep, Bella curled protectively around Charlie, her steady breathing a quiet testament to her strength. For the first time in a long time, Lucas allowed himself to believe that they were going to be okay. By dawn, the storm had passed completely, leaving the world outside the clinic wrapped in a thick, white blanket of snow. The air was eerily still, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of branches weighed down by ice. Inside, the atmosphere was warmer, alive with the fragile hope that had been born the night before. Charlie stirred again, his tiny legs kicking lightly as he let out another faint bark. Bella was immediately at his side, nuzzling him with gentle encouragement. Her tail wagged in slow, steady movements, a testament to her own recovery. Lucas sat nearby, cradling a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. His eyes were fixed on the little pup, who seemed determined to prove everyone wrong. The sight brought a small, rare smile to Lucas's face. It was hard to believe that only a few days ago, Charlie had been at death's door. Now, there was light in his eyes, a flicker of life that refused to be extinguished. "You've done something remarkable here," Dr. Meyer said, breaking the quiet. He was seated across from Lucas, a look of satisfaction on his face. "Most people wouldn't have fought this hard. They would have given up." Lucas shrugged, his voice low. "It wasn't just me. Bella. She's the one who never gave up." Dr. Meyer nodded, his gaze drifting to the dog curled protectively around her pup. "She's extraordinary, but so are you, Lucas, whether you see it or not." Ethan, who had been leaning against the wall, let out a soft chuckle. "Let's not go overboard with the compliments. He's still the same stubborn guy who thinks he can take on the world." Lucas smirked but didn't respond. There was truth in Ethan's words, but for once, he didn't mind. Being stubborn had brought them this far, and he wasn't about to change that now. As the morning wore on, Charlie grew stronger, even managing to take a few shaky steps with Bella's encouragement. The sight filled the room with a renewed sense of optimism. Dr. Meyer adjusted the heat from the generator, ensuring the warmth reached every corner of the clinic. Ethan even pitched in, hauling snow away from the building to clear a path in case of emergencies. But amidst the growing hope, Lucas couldn't shake a lingering feeling of unease. The storm was over, but their journey wasn't. Bella and Charlie's recovery would take time, and there were still practical challenges to face: food, fuel, and the reality of what came next. Later that afternoon, as Lucas stepped outside for some fresh air, he found Ethan waiting on the porch, his arms crossed. The two men stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun glint off the untouched snow. "You've got a decision to make," Ethan said finally, his tone unusually serious. Lucas frowned, glancing at him. "What are you talking about?" Ethan gestured toward the clinic. "Them, Bella, Charlie, they're not just passing through your life. Lucas, you know that. You've got to figure out what you're going to do when they're strong enough to leave." Lucas's chest tightened at the thought. He had avoided thinking too far ahead, focusing only on the immediate task of keeping them alive. But Ethan was right. Bella and Charlie had become more than a responsibility. They were family now. The idea of letting them go felt unthinkable. "I don't know," Lucas admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "I don't know what happens next." Ethan nodded, his expression softening slightly. Well, if it helps, you're not the only one who's ever felt like this. You don't have to figure it out today. Lucas didn't respond, but Ethan's words lingered in his mind as they headed back inside. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine, feeding Bella, monitoring Charlie, and making sure the clinic stayed warm. Each small victory felt monumental, but the future loomed like a question they couldn't yet answer. That evening, as the fire crackled and the room grew quiet, Lucas sat beside Bella and Charlie, his hand resting gently on her head. "I don't know what happens next," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "But I do know one thing, you're not going through it alone." Bella leaned into him, her golden eyes closing in a gesture of trust. For the first time, Lucas felt a flicker of peace. They had survived the storm, and no matter what came next, he would be there for them always. The last night at the veterinary clinic passed in quiet stillness, broken only by the soft crackling of the fire and the steady breathing of Bella and Charlie. Lucas sat beside them, gently stroking Bella's soft fur. Charlie had made remarkable progress, now able to stand on his tiny legs and curiously explore the small room. Though Lucas's body was exhausted, his mind was filled with thoughts of the future. At dawn, sunlight streamed through the frost-covered windows. Dr. Meyer rose after checking on Charlie. "The little guy has made it through the worst," he said with a small, relieved smile. "With more time and care, he'll be back to full health." Lucas exhaled deeply, a rare smile crossing his face. He turned to Bella, her golden eyes locked onto his with a look of pure trust. "We did it," he whispered, and as if to respond, Bella gently rested her head on his knee. Ethan, leaning against the doorframe, broke the moment of silence. "So, mission accomplished." "Ha!" He raised an eyebrow, his tone teasing but not unkind. "What's your plan now, Lucas?" The question had lingered in Lucas's mind since the beginning, but now he knew he couldn't avoid it any longer. Standing up, his gaze steady, he said, "They stay with me." There was no hesitation in his voice. "Bella and Charlie have been through too much to go anywhere else. This is their home now." Ethan chuckled softly. "I figured as much. But Lucas, don't just take care of them. Take care of yourself too." Lucas gave a slight nod, his expression hinting at gratitude. Ethan didn't stay long. He said goodbye with a quick pat on Lucas's shoulder and disappeared into the snowy landscape. Lucas watched him leave, knowing that while nothing was explicitly said, there was a quiet reconciliation between them, a newfound respect forged in the trials they had endured. A week later, the storm had become a distant memory. The snow began to melt, revealing the path back to Lucas's cabin. Charlie was now strong enough to run and play, always under Bella's watchful eye. She never let him stray too far. Lucas watched them with a feeling he couldn't quite name, a quiet happiness he hadn't felt in years. He started repairing the cabin, turning it into a place not just to live but to begin anew. He chopped wood, built a small play area for Bella and Charlie, and even made a trip to town to buy more toys and food for them. The once lonely man now had a reason to look forward. One sunny afternoon, as Lucas sat on the steps of the cabin, sunlight streaming through the trees, Bella approached him and gently rested her head on his shoulder. Charlie, full of boundless energy, played nearby, chasing a falling leaf. "Thank you," Lucas said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. He wasn't sure if he was speaking to Bella or to himself, but it didn't matter. Bella responded by nudging him lightly with her head, as if she understood everything he couldn't say. Their journey hadn't been a simple miracle. It was a testament to perseverance, trust, and unconditional love. Lucas, Bella, and Charlie had found each other in the storm and rebuilt the broken pieces of their lives together. They hadn't just survived the storm, they had found a family. Thank you for being a part of this journey with Lucas, Bella, and Charlie. Their story of resilience, love, and transformation is a reminder of the extraordinary bonds we share with animals and how they can heal even the most broken hearts. Now, I'd love to hear from you. If the story touched your heart, drop a 2 in the comments. If you think we could make it even better, share a 7 and let us know why. Your feedback helps us weave even more powerful stories in the future. And don't forget, sharing is caring. Share this video with someone who loves animals as much as we do. It might just brighten their day. If you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join our growing family here on Tapestry of Worlds. Together, we'll continue exploring stories that inspire, move, and connect us all. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.